The corridor outside the private council chamber was silent, yet a small wooden toy horse lay in the center of the marble floor, far from the nursery wing where it belonged. The royal guard on duty stopped, studying it. Children were never allowed near this hallway. He looked toward the chamber doors, slightly ajar, and heard a faint sound from inside. Someone crying, then abruptly silenced. The corridor outside the sealed private wing remained under controlled lighting, the ceiling lamps dimmed to their night setting, casting long, muted reflections across the polished floor. The royal guard stood at his assigned post, the echo of the earlier scream still lingering in his thoughts, not loud now, but persistent, like a vibration felt rather than heard. Procedure required him to log the anomaly, which he had already done, noting the precise time, his position, and the absence of any authorized movement in or out of the wing. A small object rested on the floor several meters from the access panel, something that had not been there during his previous patrol. He approached it carefully, crouching to examine without touching. It was a child's toy, a small carved animal, worn smooth at the edges from handling. Toys were not permitted in this corridor. Children were never allowed beyond the residential threshold without escort, and escorts logged every movement. He photographed the object, marked its position, and sealed the immediate area, placing a temporary barrier across the passage while notifying internal security that he was initiating a controlled review of corridor activity. When the duty supervisor arrived, the guard spoke calmly, presenting only the facts: an unverified scream, an unlogged object, and a sealed wing containing at least one young royal dependent under restricted supervision. The supervisor hesitated, but granted permission to review surveillance footage from the nearest internal cameras. They moved to the monitoring station adjacent to the service corridor, a quiet room humming faintly with equipment, the air cool from constant ventilation. The guard requested recordings beginning 10 minutes before the time of the incident. The technician complied, scrolling back through the timeline. At first, the footage showed nothing unusual: attendants passing earlier in the evening, lights dimming according to schedule, corridors emptying as night protocol took effect. The guard watched in silence, his attention fixed not on obvious movement, but on small inconsistencies: the rhythm of shadows, the timing of door indicators, the subtle language of a building at rest. Then, several minutes before the scream, one of the inner corridor cameras flickered, the image stuttering for less than a second before stabilizing. The technician almost missed it, but the guard asked for the sequence to be replayed at reduced speed. The flicker revealed a figure partially obscured by a column, someone standing where no one should have been during sealed wing hours. The figure moved out of frame before identification was possible. The guard felt a tightening in his chest, not fear, but a sharpening of attention, the sense that the irregularity was no longer small or isolated. He requested access to the next camera in the sequence, the one covering the antechamber leading to the private rooms, and the technician hesitated briefly before opening the file. The guard leaned closer to the screen, the quiet hum of the equipment filling the room as the recording began to play. The footage from the antechamber carried no audio, but the images were clear. A young child sat on a low, upholstered bench near the wall, shoulders trembling, one hand pressed against an arm as if holding it still. Even without sound, the guard could see the child crying, the small, uneven movements of breath unmistakable. Standing several steps away was a senior noble, identifiable by formal dress and insignia, posture rigid, one hand raised slightly, as if instructing someone out of frame to remain back. A palace attendant appeared at the edge of the camera's view, hesitated, and then disappeared, her expression tense before she disappeared from sight. The guard felt a quiet heaviness settle in his thoughts. Protective protocol required immediate intervention whenever a royal child showed signs of distress or injury, regardless of rank present. Yet the noble remained, unmoving, positioned between the child and the corridor leading to medical staff. The recording continued for nearly 2 minutes. The child's movements grew weaker, exhaustion overtaking distress, while the noble turned once toward the corridor camera, as if aware of being observed, then stepped forward, partially blocking the child from view. The technician shifted uneasily, but said nothing. The guard requested that the recording be paused and marked for evidence preservation under safeguarding protocol. His voice remained even, but his hand rested more firmly on the console than before, the knuckles pale against the dim light. He asked for the footage from adjacent angles to confirm continuity, ensuring that no segment had been altered or removed. Each camera told the same sequence: the child in visible pain, attendants held back, and no medical response initiated until several minutes after the noble finally left the frame. When the recording ended, the room seemed quieter than before, the hum of equipment now intrusive rather than neutral. The supervisor cleared his throat, suggesting that context might explain what they had seen, that rank and internal matters sometimes required discretion. The guard acknowledged the statement without agreeing. He began documenting the timeline precisely, noting the duration of the child's distress, the absence of intervention, and the presence of a senior authority figure who appeared to obstruct. As he completed the report, he felt the first pressure of what the evidence implied. This was not merely a procedural irregularity, it was a failure of protective duty within the most restricted part of the palace, and reporting such a failure, when it involved someone of high standing, would not proceed with resistance. The guard finished the entry, sealed the footage for controlled review, and prepared to request escalation, aware that the next step would move the matter beyond quiet documentation into the domain of authority, delay, and difficult decisions. By the time the guard submitted the sealed evidence request, the palace had begun to wake into its restrained morning rhythm, servants moving quietly through service corridors, distant doors opening and closing with controlled precision, and the faint scent of polished wood drifting through the administrative wing. The guard stood outside the internal review office, waiting as 2 administrative officers examined the formal documentation required to escalate an incident involving a senior noble. Their manner remained courteous but deliberate, each form checked twice, each authorization confirmed against protocol. The guard understood the necessity of procedure. The palace functioned on layers of verification designed to prevent rash decisions. Yet, as the minutes extended, he could not ignore the image of the child on the screen, shoulders shaking in silence while attendants stood held at a distance. One officer finally looked up and spoke carefully, explaining that before the footage could be shown to higher authority, contextual statements from the household staff assigned to that wing would be required. It was not refusal, but it was delay. The guard inclined his head, acknowledging the explanation, though inside he felt the quiet tension of time passing without action. He requested permission to begin collecting preliminary statements himself, arguing that the integrity of witness accounts was strongest when taken promptly. After a brief exchange, the officers agreed, granting him limited authority to record statements, but reminding him that no conclusions were to be drawn until the Review Council authorized it. The guard proceeded to the service antechamber, where attendants assigned to the private wing gathered between duties. They appeared uneasy when he arrived, their composure careful, their answers measured. One attendant admitted she had heard the child crying, but had been instructed to remain outside by the noble present. Another confirmed that medical staff had been delayed, though she could not say why. None spoke with defiance or accusation. Their tone carried the cautious restraint of people aware that hierarchy within the palace was not merely ceremonial, but enforced through careers and reputations. The guard recorded each statement precisely, neither pressing beyond what they were willing to say, nor allowing gaps to remain unnoted. When he finished, he secured the recordings and returned toward the administrative wing, the polished floors reflecting the pale light of morning. As he approached the review office again, he overheard a quiet conversation behind the partially closed door, voices discussing the implications of involving a noble of significant standing, the potential embarrassment to the household, the need for discretion. The words were not intended for him, yet they confirmed what he already sensed. The evidence alone would not be enough to move the process quickly. Later that morning, the guard was summoned into a smaller conference room where two senior administrators and a legal advisor reviewed his report. The atmosphere was controlled, the air cool, the long table cleared except for neatly aligned documents and a single screen displaying a still frame from the footage. One administrator spoke first, emphasizing that while the situation was concerning, the palace required absolute certainty before presenting allegations to the highest authority. The noble in question, he explained, held responsibilities that extended beyond the household, and any misinterpretation could carry consequences not only for individuals, but for the institution itself. The guard listened without interruption, his posture straight, his hands resting lightly against the table's edge. When invited to respond, he spoke calmly, stating only that the safeguarding protocol for minors did not depend on rank or interpretation. It depended on observable harm and the duty to intervene. He did not raise his voice or argue further, but he placed on the table the sealed storage drive containing the original recordings and the signed statements from attendants, requesting that the material be forwarded without alteration to the highest reviewing authority. The legal advisor studied him for a moment before nodding, acknowledging that the request was within his rights under protective regulations, though unusual in cases involving senior figures. The meeting ended without resolution, only a promise that the material would be reviewed and a decision communicated in due course. As the guard stepped back into the corridor, he felt the weight of uncertainty settle over him more heavily than before. He had followed protocol precisely, documented evidence, and respected every procedural boundary, yet the sense of delay remained, subtle but persistent, like pressure building behind a sealed door. That afternoon he returned to duty near the same restricted wing, the corridor now orderly and silent, the misplaced toy already removed and logged as evidence. Standing at his post, he watched the steady rhythm of the palace continue as if nothing had occurred, the distant murmur of voices, the measured footsteps of staff, the quiet ticking of a wall clock marking time with indifferent precision. He understood then that resistance within such a system rarely appeared as open opposition. It emerged as caution, as careful language, as the slow turning of administrative gears. And while those gears turned, the truth waited, suspended, dependent on whether someone with greater authority would choose to see what the guard had already witnessed. The summons arrived just before evening watch rotation, delivered in a sealed envelope bearing the mark of the private council chamber. The guard read it once, then again, confirming the time and location, before securing his post with a formal handover and proceeding through the inner corridors reserved for high-level briefings. The palace at that hour carried a different atmosphere than during the day. Movement was quieter, footsteps more deliberate, conversations held in lowered voices that seemed to fade into the stone itself. When he reached the antechamber outside the council room, an aide instructed him to wait. Through the heavy doors he could hear nothing, only the faint vibration of distant mechanical systems and the slow rhythm of his own breathing settling into calm. After several minutes, the doors opened and he was escorted inside. The room was dim except for a large display screen at the far end, its light casting a pale reflection across the polished table. Seated near the head of the table was the king, motionless, hands resting lightly together, his expression composed but distant, as though his thoughts were already focused on what he was about to see. Two senior advisors stood to one side, silent. The guard was instructed to confirm the chain of custody for the recordings. He did so precisely, stating the time of retrieval, the storage protocol, and the verification checks performed to ensure the footage remained unaltered. When he finished, the king gave a small nod and the technician began the playback. The footage unfolded in silence, the same images the guard had already seen, but now filling the larger screen with an immediacy that felt heavier in the stillness of the chamber. The child's trembling shoulders, the rigid stance of the noble, the attendants hesitating at the threshold, each detail appeared sharper in the enlarged frame, impossible to dismiss as minor or ambiguous. The guard kept his gaze forward, aware of the presence beside him, but not looking toward the king. The room seemed to grow colder as the recording continued, the quiet stretching until the faint hum of the display became the only sound. When the segment ended, no one spoke for several seconds. The king remained still, his expression unchanged, but the guard noticed a subtle shift in posture, the tightening of one hand against the other, a small movement that suggested restraint rather than calm. Finally, the king asked a single question, his voice low and controlled, requesting confirmation of the time between the child's first visible distress and the arrival of medical staff. The guard answered with the exact duration, measured and verified during his review. The king inclined his head slightly, as if committing the number to memory, and instructed that the noble present in the footage be brought to the chamber immediately. The guard felt the tension in the room deepen, not dramatic or chaotic, but dense like air before a storm that had not yet begun to break. The noble arrived within minutes, escorted but not restrained, his bearing formal, his expression composed with the confidence of rank that had rarely been challenged. He acknowledged the king with a respectful bow, then glanced briefly at the screen, where the final frame of the footage remained frozen, the child seated, head lowered, shoulders drawn inward. The king did not raise his voice as he asked for an explanation. The noble spoke in measured tones, suggesting that the child had been upset but not seriously harmed, that attendants had been dismissed temporarily to prevent unnecessary alarm, that the situation had been under control. His words were calm, almost clinical, framed as judgment calls in the interest of order. The guard stood silently, watching from the edge of the room, observing not the words themselves, but the small details surrounding them, the way one advisor shifted his weight, the tightening of the technician's jaw, the faint crease appearing at the corner of the king's eyes. When the noble finished, the king rose slowly from his chair. For a moment, he said nothing, looking instead at the frozen image on the screen. Then, without warning, his composure fractured, not in anger shouted or gestures exaggerated, but in a sudden, decisive movement as he stepped forward, brushing past the noble with a force that caused the man to lose his balance and step aside. The motion was brief, controlled, but unmistakable in its intent. The child's welfare mattered more than rank or explanation. The king ordered that the child's physician and immediate caregivers be summoned at once, and that the guard who discovered the footage accompany the medical team to verify the child's condition personally. The noble began to speak again, perhaps to protest or clarify, but the king raised his hand, silencing him without looking back. The room remained quiet as the guard received his instructions, the weight of responsibility settling over him with a clarity that left no room for hesitation. Within minutes, he was moving through the corridors toward the private wing, accompanied by medical staff carrying compact cases, their footsteps steady but urgent. As the sealed doors opened under emergency authorization, the guard felt the atmosphere change, the air inside cooler, the silence heavier, as though the wing itself held the memory of what had occurred. Somewhere ahead, beyond the softly lit corridor, a child waited, and the guard understood that whatever consequences would follow, for the noble, for the palace, perhaps even for himself, had already begun to unfold the moment that small irregularity in the night had drawn his attention. By the following morning, the palace had shifted into a controlled state of internal review, a process that altered the rhythm of movement without outwardly disturbing routine. Corridors remained open, duties continued, and ceremonies were not canceled, yet beneath the surface, a quiet network of restrictions had taken hold. Access to security archives required dual authorization. Witness movements were logged with unusual precision, and sealed evidence cabinets were placed under continuous guard. The Royal Guard, who had first reported the irregularity, found himself reassigned temporarily, not away from duty, but deeper within it, tasked with maintaining the integrity of all recordings, statements, and movement logs connected to the incident. The assignment carried no public recognition. It was delivered in a brief written order, precise and unemotional, but its implications were clear. Every piece of evidence would pass through his supervision before being transferred to the inquiry panel. He began by re-verifying the original footage, confirming timestamps, checksum records, and storage seals, documenting each step in a ledger that required signatures at every stage. The work demanded patience rather than urgency, long hours spent in the cool, quiet archive room where the air smelled faintly of paper, metal, and filtered dust. Occasionally, an official arrived requesting access, their tone courteous but insistent, asking whether certain segments could be copied or reviewed privately to prepare statements or clarify context. Each time, the guard referred to the written order and declined without deviation, offering instead to schedule supervised viewings under recorded conditions. Most accepted the refusal with polite restraint, yet he began to notice subtle signs of irritation, pauses that lingered too long, questions repeated in slightly altered forms, the careful language of people unaccustomed to being denied. Late that afternoon, a senior court secretary arrived with a request to examine preliminary witness transcripts before they were finalized. The guard explained calmly that the transcripts would be released only after certification by the inquiry panel, ensuring that no revisions or reinterpretations could be introduced. The secretary studied him for a moment, expression composed, and remarked that flexibility often helped preserve institutional harmony. The guard acknowledged the observation, but did not alter his position. After the secretary departed, the archive room felt quieter than before, the faint ticking of a wall clock marking each second with measured indifference. The guard returned to his work, aware that resistance in such environments rarely appeared as open confrontation. It moved through suggestion, through implication, through the quiet pressure to compromise in small, reasonable ways. He continued logging evidence until the light outside the narrow windows faded to evening gray, and as he sealed the final cabinet for the night, he understood that the responsibility placed upon him was not merely technical. It required steadiness, the ability to remain precise even when every surrounding voice encouraged accommodation. Over the next 2 days, the inquiry expanded, drawing statements from attendants, medical staff, and supervisory personnel assigned to the private wing. The guard attended each session in silence, seated near the recorders, ensuring that every testimony was captured in full and that no segment was paused or omitted without notation. The questioning was formal, conducted by experienced officials whose tone remained neutral, yet tension lingered in the room like a faint electrical charge. Some witnesses spoke hesitantly, choosing words with visible care, aware that their accounts involved individuals of significant rank. Others described events plainly, but avoided interpretation, leaving gaps that the panel carefully marked for follow-up. Throughout it all, the guard observed rather than intervened, his role limited to verification and security, yet he sensed the growing strain among those who preferred the matter to resolve quietly. One evening, as he prepared to secure the recording equipment, he discovered that a request had been submitted to duplicate a portion of the surveillance archive for training review. The request carried legitimate formatting, but lacked the required authorization code. He traced the submission through the internal system and reported the irregularity to the panel, who ordered an immediate audit of access logs. The incident was not dramatic, no alarm sounded, but it confirmed that someone had attempted to obtain material outside established channels. The guard felt no satisfaction in uncovering it, only a deepening awareness of how fragile the chain of evidence could be if even a single link were allowed to weaken. That night he walked the corridor outside the archive before ending his shift, the polished floor reflecting the low amber lights, the silence steady and unbroken. He paused briefly near a window overlooking the inner courtyard, where a cold wind stirred the bare branches of ornamental trees, their shadows shifting slowly across the stone. For a moment his thoughts returned to the child he had seen in the footage, now recovering under medical supervision, guarded quietly by attendants who understood, perhaps more clearly than before, the weight of their duty. The guard turned away from the window and resumed his patrol, aware that the investigation was approaching its conclusion. The pressure had not lessened. If anything, it had grown more subtle, more concentrated, as those with influence realized that the record was unlikely to be altered. And in that quiet realization, the guard sensed that the outcome, whatever it would be, was beginning to take shape, fixed not by speeches or declarations, but by the steady, unbroken line of evidence that no one had succeeded in bending. The formal findings were delivered in a sealed session held in one of the smaller council chambers, a room chosen not for ceremony but for clarity, its high windows admitting a pale, steady light that revealed every movement without casting shadows. The royal guard was not seated at the table with the panel, but stood along the wall, present in his capacity as evidence custodian, responsible for verifying that every recording, transcript, and log presented matched the originals secured in the archive. The proceedings were methodical, each conclusion supported by documented testimony and time-stamped records. The inquiry determined that the noble had exercised authority in a manner that obstructed medical access and delayed care to a minor under palace protection, constituting a misuse of position and a breach of safeguarding duty. The language of the judgment was precise, stripped of accusation or emotion, yet its meaning carried unmistakable weight. Administrative measures were outlined, including removal of certain privileges, reassignment pending further review, and a formal notation entered into internal records. More significant than the disciplinary actions, however, were the procedural changes announced immediately afterward. A new safeguarding protocol required that any sign of physical distress involving a minor within the palace grounds trigger an automatic medical alert that could not be overridden by rank alone. Movement logs in private wings would now be mirrored in an independent monitoring channel, and surveillance archives involving child welfare incidents would be subject to automatic preservation and review by a designated oversight unit. As each measure was read into the record, the guard listened with quiet attention, recognizing in the language of policy the direct influence of what had begun as a small irregularity on a silent corridor. When the session concluded, the panel members signed the final certification of evidence integrity, and the documents were sealed. One of the senior administrators approached the guard afterward, thanking him in formal terms for his precision and restraint. The acknowledgment was brief, professional, and without ceremony, yet it carried a sincerity that required no elaboration. The guard inclined his head in response and returned to the archive room to complete the final transfer of materials, logging the closure of the case with the same careful handwriting he had used on the first report. As he locked the cabinet and verified the seal, the room felt unusually still. the low hum of the ventilation and the faint scent of metal and paper unchanged, yet the sense of unfinished tension that had filled the space for days had eased, replaced by the quiet finality of a record completed. Within a week, routine gradually resumed its familiar rhythm. Patrol rotations returned to normal schedules, administrative corridors lost their guarded quiet, and the steady, ordered movement of palace life continued with the discipline that made its operations appear effortless from the outside. The guard returned to his standard post assignments, including the same corridor outside the private wing where the incident had first drawn his attention. The lighting there remained unchanged, soft and even, the polished floor reflecting the overhead lamps in long, uninterrupted lines. The place where the toy had been found was now indistinguishable from the rest of the corridor, the surface restored, the evidence removed to secure storage. Yet as he walked his patrol, the guard could not pass that section without recalling the moment he had first noticed the small object resting where nothing should have been. The memory did not come as a dramatic image, but as a quiet awareness, a reminder carried in the rhythm of his steps and the steady sweep of his gaze along the walls and doors. One evening, as he paused near the access panel to verify its status, he heard distant laughter echo faintly from deeper within the residential wing, the sound of children at play under supervision, light and untroubled. He stood for a moment, listening, then resumed his patrol, the measured cadence of his boots returning to the familiar pattern of duty. The investigation had changed procedures, reinforced safeguards, and clarified responsibilities, but the guard understood that no system, however precise, could eliminate the need for vigilance. Rules established structure, yet it was attention, the willingness to notice what did not belong, to pause when something felt wrong, that protected the vulnerable in the quiet hours when no one expected danger. As the corridor lights dimmed to their night setting and the palace settled into silence, the guard completed his round and recorded the final entry of his shift. The words were simple, routine, noting that all areas were secure and no irregularities observed. He closed the logbook, secured it in its case, and stepped back into the corridor, the air cool, the silence steady, and the memory of that small, misplaced detail remaining with him, not as a burden, but as a quiet certainty that vigilance, once proven necessary, could never again be taken lightly.